Okay, well, thank you for having me here, Kai and the Disrupt Sydney group. And thank you for that very nice introduction. I, in my sort of day job as a consultant in the digital design sphere, I spend my time typically helping big business avoid being disrupted. So this topic was an interesting ask for me. Today I'm going to talk to you about a rich vein of digital disruption that I personally believe is going to have a greater impact on the Australian economy, livelihoods and Australian tables than anything else in the next few years. And what's more, it's a bit of a personal story. So I hope you'll bear with me with these slides. This is me, circa 1980 or so. I am, as Ella pointed out, the first child of a fifth-generation grazier, and I grew up here at Balaclava in Glen Innes on 7,000 acres of prime New England country in northern New South Wales. So we ran merino sheep and Angus cattle, and my dad did things in much the same way as his dad did and the three generations that had come before him. We grew crops to sustain sheep and cattle, and stockwood mustered on horseback and tagged and drenched in yards not too dissimilar from those ones. And the majority of my family's food was produced on the land that we owned. So we grew our own fruit and vegetables most of the time. Milk, butter, cream was produced in our own dairy. And when we wanted meat, Dad would slaughter a beast and butcher it in the meat room. Well, that's what I used to call it anyway. What you're looking at here is very nice pictures of stables and a wool shed and assorted other farm buildings. It was a pretty idyllic, if not particularly fashion-conscious, way to grow up. Like most pastoralists in our district, Dad used fertilisers to enhance soil quality and pesticides like Roundup to manage weeds. Today, fertilisers are estimated by the UN to account for roughly 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions. But I grew up thinking that the ozone layer was being destroyed by people using spray-on deodorant. Organic soil managements, like crop rotation combined with precision planting, are now being practiced on a massive scale in the Salinas Valley, just an hour down the road from its much more famous cousin, Silicon Valley. And those kinds of techniques were discussed, but largely dismissed as unconventional and unevidenced in the local community while I was growing up. These kinds of farm management methods now deliver substantial yields on traditional industrial agricultural methods, and they actually reduce farm costs. Even without the premium attracted by organic produce, these farms would still be more profitable than their traditional counterparts, simply because they don't spend good money on fertiliser, pesticides and expensive GMO seed. But Dad wasn't aware of any of that while I was growing up. The fashion at the time was towards feedlots, because there was a rapidly growing market for premium grain-fed beef in Japan. But again, my dad wasn't much of a trend follower. He wasn't into fashions much, so our cattle were all grass-fed, much to the benefit of the local community and relief of it. Feedlots were universally opposed by locals due to their smell. Unfortunately, it wasn't always green. Successive droughts in 1980, 1982, 1985, several years through the early 1990s, combined with interest rates as high as 17%, falling commodity prices, declining productivity, high rates of inflation and labour, effectively continually threatened our viability. And eventually, my dad sold up, severing my family's link with the past, and what my brother had always assumed till that point was his future. Today, Australia has the 6th highest labour costs in the world. It's twice as expensive as New Zealand, and multi-factor productivity has been negative for 7 out of the last 9 years. So I'm faced with a rather disturbing question. Is this the future of Australia's 130,000 family-owned farms? Maybe. But I want to tell a different story now. Today, the population is growing by roughly 80 million a year, and it's expected to reach probably in the region of 10 billion by 2050, at the same time as the middle class is expected to double. So Asia is actually expected to account for about 71% of the growth in global food demand up to 2050, with much of this demand coming from China. Australia, right now, is on the hunt for a new source of economic growth. The mining boom is dwindling, and it's not hard to see why Deloitte has named agriculture as having the greatest potential of any Australian industry to deliver the kind of growth that politicians across the nation would love to see over the next few decades. Export to Asia represents a truly massive opportunity for Australian agriculture. Quite simply, if we could find new sustainable ways to feed the growing Asian middle class at scale, we really could have a dining boom on our hands, which would not only replace the mining boom, but be renewable to boot. The government is actually already tentatively exploring ways to do just that. And it's exploring developing Northern Australia. This is a terrible slide, so I apologise in advance, but really what it's trying to say is that there's a region of Australia which reaches all the way from Rockhampton in far north Queensland, all the way across the Northern Territory to Karratha in WA. It's a region that's basically everything above the Tropic of Capricorn. And Australia is actually unique among the developed countries in the world in that we sit at the intersection of two great regions of global economic and population growth. So you've got Asia on the one hand and the tropics on the other, and together they account for about 40% of the world's population. Not only this, but this area of Australia actually has the fundamentals that are perfect for agriculture. About 90 million megalitres of water flow into the Gulf of Carpentaria every year, which is about 3 times that of the entire Murray-Darling system. There are 2 billion hectares of land up here in abundant sunshine, perfect for irrigated agriculture. The biomass you can grow under those conditions is pretty much astonishing, and there is a huge potential to produce free renewable energy to fuel all of those operations. So I wanted to show you this. This is Etheridge Integrated Agriculture Project, otherwise known as IFED. It's located roughly 400 kilometres inland from Townsville in far north Queensland. And this project plans to capture and store about 550 gigalitres of water annually, which is about enough to fill Sydney Harbour. It plans to use that water to irrigate about 650 square kilometres of sugarcane and guar bean crops. And the project is intended to be entirely energy self-sufficient. So it will use sugarcane byproduct to generate power for the sugar mill, as well as produce about 400,000 tonnes a year of stock feed from waste material from that sugarcane. Another 2,400 square kilometres will be put aside for cattle grazing with a small on-site meat works. So this is a fully integrated, self-sufficient farm generating sugar, biomass, electricity, agave and beef. And at the height of its construction, it's forecast to employ about 3,000 people with an ongoing operational workforce of about 1,000 and annual forecasts of revenue almost $1 billion a year. But like everything, it's complicated. IFED has estimated that they're going to need a shed load of water for this operation to work. And the region is under a resources and water management plan currently, which restricts the amount of water that can be extracted from the Gilbert River system to about 10% of total outflow. So if IFED was to go ahead, it would pretty much leave no more water for anyone else. No other smaller farms in the region would be able to extract any water from the same system. Now, the chairman of IFED, Keith DeLacy, says that large-scale farming, as opposed to a series of small-scale projects, is a much more efficient way to go. It's a much more worthwhile investment. They think that they can make annual revenues of $2,000 per megalitre of water that they use and about $1,400 per hectare of land. And he argues that if anyone can do better than that, then they should have the land and they should have the water. He says if the government is serious about getting major agricultural development, you won't get it by small fragmented allocations of water. You need to have size to be able to establish all the processing infrastructure that makes it work. So it's an interesting conundrum. There's also another problem with Northern Australia in that it lacks a few essentials, like people and roads and infrastructure. There is no location advantage if you have to ship the product south before it's exported. So scale is essential to developing the north, so is capital. It runs completely counter to the traditional focus on the family farm as the nucleus of Australian agriculture. And we have a real cultural and political attachment to the family farm. It's just that it's not necessarily the right vehicle for developing the north. So my question is this the future of Australian agriculture? I'm not sure. So I'm going to tell one more story. I don't live here anymore. I live here in Leichhardt, just up the road. And this is me eating out with my two boys. Despite the fact that I grew up without supermarket meat, or bought biscuits for that matter, today my shopping habits and attitudes to food are broadly representative of an educated middle class in Australia. And I worry a lot that the food my family and I eat is a black box. When I buy meat from a supermarket, I'm aware that I don't know much about the animal that it was, how it lived, what its diet was, how it was slaughtered, all kinds of things. And I'm really worried about reports that there are 50% more food allergies in developed nations today than there were 14 years ago. It's a massive increase in a really short space of time. And I'm increasingly distrustful of a food system that is so complex and has such a long, largely non-transparent supply chain driving it. And that lack of confidence has implications if rolled out amongst the whole of the Australian population for Australia's farmers, who currently produce about 93% of the food that we eat every day. Today, as urban families, far removed from the food and fibre production system, if we're environmentally aware, we might embrace meatless Mondays, we might grow our own, we might choose local, seasonal or organic produce, or we might participate in a co-op like the one started by my friends here. However, as we become more aware that that food system that is currently in place is responsible for roughly 20 to 30% of all greenhouse gas produced, we might even embrace the Omnivores Dilemma, not the Disruptors' Dilemma or the Innovators' Dilemma, but the Omnivores Dilemma, and get ready for a Silicon Valley-style disruption. This is the City Farming Project in Amsterdam. Lettuce crops are being cultivated under LED lights in fully automated production areas. And the benefit of this production concept is that in the near future, vegetables will be able to be cultivated anywhere in the world, regardless of season or climate, without fertilizer, pesticides, or genetically modified seeds. In fact, without anything other than solar energy. We might also reconsider how much meat we eat. I believe that Australians have roughly halved the amount that we were eating in the 70s, which I can't quite fathom because we're still eating an awful lot of it, but that is apparently what has happened. So there is a downward trend anyway, and that means that the meat production industry and the beef production industry specifically, which accounts for roughly 50% of all agricultural activity on Australian farms, if we were to have a disruption to beef eating, it would be hugely disruptive for the Australian market. Australia is actually the largest beef exporter in the world after Brazil as well. But the largest disruptor of beef is actually 3D printing. I know it's come up before, but the world's first synthetically produced and 3D printed hamburger was actually eaten last year, and at enormous cost. One day soon, it will become a reality for Australian families, and at that point we'll have to ask ourselves how many of us are willing to eat and feed their family with a foodini. So I know I'm over time and I'm going to quickly rush through the end of my presentation, but to meet the anticipated increase in global food demand. The world needs to produce more food. And I think that seeing this challenge as a crisis of supply can really lead us to believe that we have no choice in how we intensify agricultural production. But the reality is that the world does have choices. Australia has choices. We have the know-how to do things differently. In fact, we may not even need more food. The food that we have is not very evenly distributed right now, and while many countries face chronic food scarcity, the food that we do produce is currently being lost through spoilage and wastage at rates as high as 40% throughout the developing and developed world. So we may hope to see the world produce more with less, using less energy, fertilizer and pesticides, less environmental impacts, but that's not currently the trajectory that we're on. In our race to produce more, there is very little to stop us from, in the short term anyway, from using more natural resources, more chemicals, more land and more energy to feed ourselves. So how do we disrupt agriculture for good? I've used stories today to communicate my message, and I've told them, all of them, from my perspective. Stories need perspective. A picture tells 1,000 words, but it only tells part of the story. Even in our globally networked 140-character world, there's not one truth. There are many different perspectives to consider. There are, in fact, no right answers. Social, environmental and economic considerations need to come into play. Issues of livelihoods, rural development and health are central. We could choose to limit agricultural expansion, encourage new crops and greater genetic diversity. We could choose to protect the ecological foundation of food security. We could choose to focus on integrated farming systems. And we could choose to invest differently, to avoid dangerous climate change, to limit consumption, and to focus on alternate energy sources for agricultural intensification. And that's why in 3 days' time I'll be heading up to Tamworth with the Australian Fruit Futures Project to help facilitate 60 leaders. This is us in Q Station a few months ago, to help 60 leaders across the agricultural sector identify and design and test practical ideas to foster innovation and increase agricultural investment and improve the level of community trust in the agricultural supply chain. We have choices. We need greater debate of the issues affecting agriculture, because while we may not care much about the economics of the ag industry, we do care about what ends up on our plates. And that's why the story of disruption of agriculture is going to be personal for each and every one of us. Thank you very much.